House Republicans have advanced a stopgap bill to avoid a government shutdown, with the final vote expected to happen later today.
Here to weigh in is the Hill's Mychael Schnell. Thank you for being with us. Can you tell us a little bit about... Absolutely. Can you tell us a little bit about what's going on, what the current state of the shutdown is in the halls of Congress?
Yeah, look, right now up here on Capitol Hill, the chances of a shutdown are much greater than not. In fact, some folks are saying that a shutdown at the end of the day tomorrow is inevitable. And that's because right now there's no clear path to a stopgap bill to keep the government funded beyond tomorrow night's midnight deadline. Just a few minutes ago, the House advanced a partisan stopgap bill that's intended to keep the government open until October 31st. It would also implement a number of spending cuts, and it includes a number of border security provisions, ones that were passed as part of the House GOP conference's marquee border bill. But that piece of legislation is expected to fail when it comes to the House floor for a final vote later today. A number of hardline conservatives, by the Hill's count, it's at least 9, have said that they are either a hard no on the legislation or leaning in that direction. A number of those hardliners have said that they just won't support a continuing resolution under any circumstances. So, while a failed vote would be a defeat for Speaker Kevin McCarthy, who has pushed for the stopgap bill to make it over the finish line, it wouldn't actually change the Congress's the government's chances of a shutdown, because this piece of legislation was widely expected to not move in the Senate, where Democrats would be starkly opposed to it. The White House this morning also issued a veto threat. So that's what's going on in the House right now. When you look at the other chamber of Congress, when you look at the Senate, they are moving ahead with a bipartisan continuing resolution that would keep the lights on until November 17th. It includes also billions of dollars for aid to Ukraine, in addition to disaster relief. That one is expected to pass within the coming days on a bipartisan basis. But Speaker Kevin McCarthy has said that he will not bring it to the floor for a vote. A number of conservatives have voiced concerns with the Ukraine funding and the lack of border security provisions included in that Senate bill. So right now, where things stand, there is not a clear path to keeping the government open beyond the end of this month. And again, that deadline tomorrow night at midnight.
We've also heard previously that some members of the Freedom Caucus are happy to just pass individual appropriations bills one at a time. What is the status on that, Michael? Is there any possibility of them having the leverage to make that the new process as opposed to just passing CR after CR?
Well, look, the message here from Speaker Kevin McCarthy is that they want to continue with this appropriations process. Just last night, House Republicans got 3 of those appropriations bills over the finish line. One of them, one funding agriculture and the FDA, did not pass. That brings a total of 4 of 12 appropriations bills passed by the House. And again, Speaker McCarthy's message here is he wants to continue through regular order, and he wants to get the remaining 8 appropriations bills over the finish line. But there's just not enough time for that with how much time is left until the government funding runs out. Again, that deadline is tomorrow night. The House still has to get 8 of those bills across the finish line. The Senate has not passed any of those bills. And then the 2 chambers are going to have to hash out their differences and to come to some sort of consensus on those spending measures, because for start, they're very apart in terms of top line numbers and other policy riders. So when hardline conservatives say that they want to continue with the appropriations process, that is also what Speaker Kevin McCarthy is saying. McCarthy, however, wants to pass a stopgap to buy some more time. Some of these hardlines of conservatives are saying they will not support a continuing resolution. And they're saying, you know what, instead the House and Congress should have started its work earlier. It's because of their lack of trying to get this done in a quicker fashion that we're now staring down a shutdown.
Yeah, and if I can follow up on that real quick, because Congressman Gates has basically said, I've had the wool pulled over my eyes enough times where I have the promise of a continuing resolution, we'll continue the appropriation work afterwards, and then it doesn't end up happening. And now there's reports that he's had this really knockdown, drag-out fight with Speaker McCarthy behind closed doors. How does that acrimonious relationship at this point and the lack of trust there affect this whole process?
Well, it doesn't help, right? It definitely doesn't help. But one thing I'll note when you talk about this relationship between Gaetz and McCarthy, that the acrimony between the two men is nothing new. We'll remember back to the January speaker's race. Matt Gaetz never, not once throughout all 15 ballots of voting, gave his support to Kevin McCarthy. The two have traded personal barbs throughout the months, but these tensions between the two have really been heightened in recent weeks as Congress has been has been moving forward in the appropriations process and through this spending battle. And that all comes on the backdrop of Matt Gaetz heightening his threats to force a vote on ousting McCarthy as Speaker. He has said that if McCarthy does not answer a number of demands that have to do with legislation and spending, he will force a vote on ousting Kevin McCarthy as Speaker. So when you get into these funding negotiations, of course, House Republicans can just afford to lose a handful of votes on any partisan spending bill because of that slim majority. So this acrimony is definitely not helpful when you talk about this math problem that McCarthy is going to find himself in time and time again on these sometimes controversial spending bills.
We had AOC criticize Tony Gonzalez for visiting the border with Elon Musk amid trying to prevent the government shutdown and passing a stopgap bill. Do you identify this as a problem at all, the absence of certain representatives affecting their ability to actually pass a stopgap bill?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It's what I said before. It all comes down to this math problem. If you have a full Congress, all members are in, House Republicans can only afford to lose 4 of their own members on any given vote. So when you start talking about these absences, that margin can decrease, and that can, make it easier for Democrats to defeat a motion or a procedural vote or even a full piece of legislation. So yeah, Tony Gonzalez not being in Washington for those votes, it doesn't make McCarthy's job any helpful because, again, as you start getting to these absences and the more members that are not present to vote, that lowers the margin of the members that they can lose on any of these given partisan votes.
And as we head into a fall election season in Virginia, there's a state House of Delegates and Senate elections going on across the board there. I've heard from some Republican strategists and donors that they're quite concerned about the effect that a shutdown might have on Republicans' chances there because there are so many government employees who live in Northern Virginia. Michael, if you could just break down a little bit some of the outside consequences of a government shutdown, both politically and personally, for the people who might be put out of work.
Yeah, sure. Personally, I mean, they are significant, right? A number of federal workers will be furloughed, going without pay. There's also questions about pay for members of the armed services and the military. So that is not going to be a great situation for some of these federal workers who are not deemed essential during this period of time for the shutdown. And then when you talk about the political ramifications, this is something that I've been keeping a close eye on up here on Capitol Hill. There are a handful of Republican House members who are representing districts that President Biden won back in 2020. Look, Democrats right now are already messaging this potential, rather impending shutdown as something that was caused by Republicans and by, we've seen Leader Jeffries, for example, say this is a MAGA Republican shutdown crisis. That's not going to be helpful for some of those more moderate Biden district Republicans when they're trying to run for reelection, again, in these blue districts. And this messaging has them being part of a group that forced a shutdown. So politically and personally speaking, there downfalls to a shutdown. And I'll just note, this is something that Speaker Kevin McCarthy has been messaging in recent weeks. He's been saying, I don't want a shutdown. A shutdown doesn't help anybody. In fact, nobody wins a shutdown. Historically speaking, Republicans have come out of shutdowns, not A, getting any of the demands they had asked for, and B, just looking worse politically. This is a message we've been seeing from McCarthy to try to cajole his conference into supporting a partisan stopgap bill that can then put them in a stronger position to negotiate with Democrats in both the Senate and the White House.
It appears to me that there's an ongoing debate within Congress as to whose fault this is. You have Marjorie Taylor Greene clearly blaming the Democrats. You have Matt Gaetz directly saying this wouldn't be the Democrats' fault. We can blame Speaker McCarthy. And then Speaker McCarthy saying we have to do something about the crisis at the border. If the government does shut down, this will not be our fault. It seems that McCarthy well knows that with his provision on the border in the bill, it would not pass the Senate. So is that why we have most folks blaming McCarthy, even Republicans from within, the House GOP blaming McCarthy for this shutdown? How do you see that debate shaking out?
Yeah, look, it's an interesting question. I think that one of the reasons why McCarthy is taking some heat right now when it comes to this impending shutdown is because when you look on the Senate side, Leader McConnell and Leader Schumer have been moving forward in a bipartisan manner. They've so far cleared 2 procedural hurdles to advance a bipartisan continuing resolution that will kick the funding deadline to November 17th. It appropriates money for Ukraine aid in addition to disaster relief. It extends authorization of the FAA. So you see the Senate moving forward on a bipartisan basis. But again, to something I mentioned earlier, Kevin McCarthy says that if the Senate passes that, which is widely expected to happen within the coming days, he would not put it on the floor for a vote. That's because a number of conservatives have said that they are opposed to the Ukraine funding within the lack of border security provisions that were included in that piece of legislation. So, that sort of gives people the ammo to be able to say, well, Kevin McCarthy, this is a viable plan to fund the government. You're refusing to bring it to the floor for a vote, which, by the way, would pass with wide bipartisan margins. Again, this is something that has the blessing of both McConnell and Schumer. So I think that's why McCarthy's taking some heat right now. But on the other side of it, the vote later today will be a really big determination of how things go from here. Because if the House Republicans are able to get that partisan stopgap over the finish line, which again is not expected amid this conservative opposition, they're then able to have stronger leverage at the negotiating table and say, well, we passed something, Senate, why don't you take it up? Of course, that's never going to happen with the Senate controlled by Democrats. Democrats strongly opposed to, as you mentioned, the border provisions in there. Also, the spending cuts in there. There are pretty deep spending cuts made in a lot of different areas of the federal budget. So that's sort of when you start getting into what ends up being Washington's favorite pastime, the blame game. But right now, as things stand, McCarthy's taking a lot of heat because we see the Senate moving forward in a bipartisan fashion. McCarthy is giving in to the demands of his right flank.
Mychael Schnell, congressional reporter for The Hill, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.